Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Hi, Cynthia. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I reached out to you, as we were just talking about, I reached out to you originally because of I came across your name because of your association with the Jung Foundation. And then just perusing your website and the things you're kind of interested in, there was this coming together or this synthesis of various different esoteric ideas. And so one of it was obviously Carl Jung and your training as a psychoanalyst, but then the other part of it was astrology and alchemy, and both of which to me are very fascinating. Maybe systems or mythological, I don't know what you would call them, but esoteric systems. And so that's why, go ahead.
I was just going to say ancient symbol systems.
Yes, yeah.
Been around for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I just find that all that stuff fascinating, and I don't have really any background in astrology. Probably the closest, I've read a few books that skim over it. I've talked to a couple of astrologers in person, but it was always just like a friendly kind of run into each other at a meetup or some kind of social event. So I've never had, as I mentioned before, I've never had my astrological chart read, but so I'm just really interested in it. I'm curious about it. And I have some thoughts about, really big picture, some thoughts about how astrology fits in to kind of the greater story of humankind. But first, before we get into any of that, what I really like to understand is just what drew you to this world. Where did you start? Was it on the Jungian side or the astrology side? And what was it that, I don't know, drew you to it? And then when you begin to see that those two worlds could pair, what did that look like for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was definitely drawn to the Jungian world first, and going into training to be a psychoanalyst was really a second career. So I kind of almost hit my midlife crisis. I was an artist first. And really thought of myself as an artist and did that for kind of part of my adult life. And even then, I think, so astrology kind of hovered as something I was interested in, but I actually had a real skeptic's ear for it, which, looking back on it, I think a lot of the collective, society kind of has that ear where the sound of it, it's a simple system that has its own terminology, and it's kind of cloaked in that terminology. So astrologers will speak in that language, and it's opaque if you haven't studied it. And it also, there was actually something that I guess I was both attracted to it and a little bit irritated by the sound of it. And I finally had a couple of good readings myself of my chart kind of around the time of my midlife crisis, early 40s. And at that point, there was one particular reading by a Jungian analyst. And there aren't many Jungian analysts who are astrologers who are out of the closet. I think there are probably many, many more that are interested in it. But this particular person, Julie Bresciani, had studied at the C.G. Jung Institute in New York and had subsequently moved to the Southwest and was a practicing astrologer predominantly. But I think she combined the two. And I really loved having readings with her, and I wish she unfortunately passed away about 5 or 7 years ago, and I never got a chance to really work analytically with her. And that became, I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but she was my first. I started when I had a reading with her, and I had a few key insights with her. I think that was the important thing. And it was just, even though I had been in Jungian analysis for years, because that's actually since I was 29, off and on. And then that's also a prerequisite. You need that for training. So that had really been my foundation. And then, so at that point, I think that was it, that I realized I had obtained these insights that I had never had years of analysis, and just slowly got interested in it and started, I think, I started reading it, but I also would just have readings from different astrologers, because it was a kind of, everyone had their different subjective take. I was really interested in that. And I remember Julie Bresciani saying that this is the Archimedean point, it's the objective psyche. But I was also interested in how subjective, the different points of view of different astrologers. I got a reading from Robert Hand, who, if anyone knows, he's a very, very well-known astrologer, and maybe 5 or 6 other astrologers. And I have, over the years done that. So, and I would have people that I knew get readings, and if they would allow me to hear the taped sessions, I was learning. So I was comparing, I did, had my sister get a reading, and of course I knew her very well. And so I was just kind of absorbing the kind of knowledge of the psyche of the person, and then the reading. And astrology is really so complex. It's very hard to learn it in a kind of linear way. I mean, there's some memorization, but it really, there's so many layers to a chart that maybe that's where a little bit of alchemy comes in. It really has a way of just sort of, you start absorbing it and kind of learning it piece by piece, like what would come forward as something relevant. So a lot of people will get an astrological reading when they're in a crisis or there's some problem, and that's kind of the in, that's a focus for an astrologer. That's not too different from analysis. When someone comes into analysis, it's kind of, there's a kind of a focal piece or a point of a problem, the problem. And it's the entry point to this kind of deeper, many layers of the personality, as things start unfolding, then a bigger picture and, starts appearing. And I'm starting now, as I'm speaking, to really compare the two, because they both have this kind of evolving kind of holism that you never really have a conscious program or design for. It really does evolve, and kind of, certain things appear at certain times. And there's a timing of the psyche unfolding and analysis, just as there is, when we look at it astrologically, we think of transits, that's what we can see in the phenomenology of the chart, but what is also happening astronomically, in the sky. So there's a kind of timing to things being revealed. But the astrology, it's a, so I'll backtrack a little bit. So I had that experience. It started really intensifying towards the end of my Jungian training, which took some time. I did a kind of eclectic psychoanalytic training for 4 years, got my license, then went into Jungian training specifically, which I knew I was initially going to do. I'd been interested in Jung beginning in college, and then I'd been in Jungian analysis. So it was something that his language made sense to me. It made Psyche make sense. And I had used it with, I was a literature major in college, and I was reading Jung at the same time and really seeing, I think literature is a great psychological feast if you have a psychological viewpoint. And so I was kind of using a lot of Jung's terms to sort of look at James Joyce, was my first It's like, wow, some of the very same, psychic components I can see them. And so I was very excited about that. But I'm kind of talking holistically too. I'm not being very linear. I realize that. But I didn't really, it was really at the end of my Jungian training that I just, and at the end you write a thesis. That's kind of, you're a project in my particular association. And it kind of lit on fire. I mean, I really, really started reading it and taking it seriously. And there was one analyst in my association who I knew liked astrology. And so she was my advisor. And that was, I think I was, for the first time, I was aware of an actual transit that was going on in my own chart, which is the planet Uranus coming into conjunction with my midheaven. And the midheaven is a place in the chart that symbolically is where a person is out in the world, connecting to the outer world and appearing in the outer world. It's where the sun, it's kind of midheaven, where the sun is at noon. And Uranus is a planet that was discovered through technology, not the naked eye, in the late 1700s. And it corresponded with the Enlightenment period. And it has always held the symbolism and the correspondence of the Enlightenment, technology. And then, when you think of an archetype and all of the sort of ideas that kind of constellate around those ideas, revolution and change. So the societal things going on when it was discovered are, on a personal level, they do reverberate as well. Some kind of new vision can be a kind of sudden change or sudden awakening. So all of these linked ideas that an astrologer will talk about the planet. When it hit my midheaven, I realized I just knew just enough astrology to know the symbolism of Uranus and the midheaven, and realized that I was having this transit, and I was also really interested in astrology suddenly, like eating, sleeping, drinking it, probably doing all that. But ended up writing my thesis, and maybe I should pause and take a breath. I mean, that was kind of the from kind of that kind of deeper psychological insights that I had to actually bringing it out a little bit into the world. I mean, it was just, but it was not something that we learned in Jungian training. Like you said a few minutes ago, Jung talks about astrology, and this is becoming more and more, I think, a conversation somewhat with Jungians, but much more among astrologers, many of whom talk about Jung.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because just like you were saying, when you came across Jung, it really helped you. It gave you like this language to be able to discuss the psyche. And I could see that, whether it's astrology or alchemy or any other, whether it's a pagan system, or even when I read any of the Greek stories, once you read Jung and you have that language, especially around, the pieces of the psyche, the different aspects of the psyche, and then also the archetypes, all of a sudden, everything you encounter, you suddenly can see the symbology of it, the imagery of it. And then, it doesn't matter whether it's you're talking about the planets, or you're talking about a collection of gods living on Mount Olympus. Once you can see the archetypal symbology of it, you can relate to it in such a way where you go, oh, like I've seen those patterns in my life. I've seen that character in my life or in myself. And it becomes this way of interpreting all stories or all symbolic systems in a way that they kind of all come to life for you. They become meaningful, or they have some kind of, it's like a little key that you can open up the door with.
Do you remember when that happened for you? Because I think there is I know there was a moment for me, not a literal moment, but when it's almost like it does open up, reading a fairy tale and having it suddenly, you see the connection, the symbolic connection to Psyche. Did you do that on your own through just reading?
Yeah. For me, so I talk about this every now and then on here with guests, but for me, my background was very religious. I grew up in an LDS family or a Mormon family. And so in that system, religion was very concrete. It was very literal. And so you almost didn't even see symbols at all. It was all just so tangible in a way. And so it made it, I think deep down, I was always the kind of person who I understood story. I feel like I'm a storyteller. I'm a writer. And there was a point in my early 30s, about a decade ago, that I stepped away from the religion of my upbringing. And at that point, I that was kind of like my dark night of the soul. That was my time in the desert, because I had to, what I was feeling at the time was the framework through which I had viewed the world was suddenly falling apart. And it wasn't, I didn't understand the world anymore. I didn't understand myself. I didn't understand the people around me, my relationships. And so I had to go into this process of trying to figure it all out. And I started off more on the science side of things for the first time in my life, learning about things like evolution. And somewhere about 5-6 years into that process, I started reading Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell, he's great. People love him for his Hero of a Thousand Faces. But what I really found valuable from Joseph Campbell was his series called The Masks of God, which took all of these different myths from all of these different times and places and kind of showed how they grew one upon another over time. And it was almost like seeing the cultural evolution of humanity, where we went from one stage to another. And it was during that the name Carl Jung started popping up. And then just by chance, I had a brother-in-law who was a teacher, and at his school, they had a big stack of books that they were getting rid of. And he had this big copy, like a really big copy. It's probably, I don't know, it's the size of a notebook, but it was a copy of Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols, which is, it's not just Carl Jung, but it's a bunch of other people, Marie von Franz and several others. And I just read through that, and it hit me in such a way where it felt like I was reading a book that wasn't just a book. It felt more like when I was a kid and my family would read scriptures, and it was supposed to be like the scriptures were something special, something true. In a sense, it was kind of like this feeling of like, whoa, like I can see all this now. All of a sudden it's starting to make sense to me. It became so tangible. And so ever since then, I've really gone after that type of material. I've read lots of different books in that space. Another writer that really helped me understand that evolution of religion or myth, the psyche, is Karen Armstrong. She wrote the book History of God. And so just diving into books like that, and then finding I enjoy listening to podcasts because, when I'm exercising, driving, when I'm working in the yard. And so just finding a lot of podcasts about people talking about that, which eventually led me to realize, I could do this myself and just actually have conversations with people like yourself who have so much experience with it and have dove into it themselves. And so, yeah, it really did open the world up to me in a new way. And the funny thing about that was that I had always wanted to be a writer my whole life, but I never really felt like I had anything worth writing until I came across this world of symbols and myth. And then I suddenly realized that I had a lot of things worth writing about. I just hadn't had the language to analyze them and then put them into some kind of fictional story. So yeah, it really changed for me. It changed my whole life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful journey. And I like, it's interesting to link, I had never in my mind linked Joseph Campbell with Marie von Franz, but I think they both are unique in being able to do specifically that, to kind of, I'm not sure Marie von Franz does the historical bit, as much, which to me, kind of the evolution of symbolism and thought, symbolic thought, which is a real interest of mine. But they both really do open up, the kind of symbolism in that kind of very, appealing storytelling kind of way. So I think for me, it was, Marie von Franz and fairy tales, and the way she actually did reveal the psyche in the fairy tales. And I can remember kind of getting shivers, and it was like, but it's like suddenly, something surface opens up and it's alive. And then, like you said, you begin to be able to really see everything that way. And even I think, being an analyst, it's, I work a lot with dreams, so that's certainly a parallel, world. But, regular life is that same, we lead a sort of concrete life on the surface where, a lot of stuff happens, events happen, things are kind of concrete. And it's the same, being able to kind of see through. I think James Hillman really talks about seeing through, the sort of concrete image or the concrete thing in our life to the meaning, and kind of the archetype, which really is just like the essence of it, which is not just another word, to correspond to the event, but it is something that then feels really alive, or it kind of opens up the concrete or the phenomenology, into this. It's why I think Jung talked about use the word numinous, to describe how we experience archetypes, and so it's not theory. It really is something that feels very alive and kind of beyond us in a way. I think it actually does have an effect on our mind. I read somewhere, it was the Jungian Jean Knox in one of her books. She's quoting someone else, but she talks about metaphor actually causing, kind of the whole brain to light up, all of the neurons, and, it almost has this holistic effect on the brain, on the physiological brain, and that corresponds to a feeling, an actual experience that we have when something, we get out of some narrow part of our brain working on something specific to where everything connects. And I'm just using the term everything, but it kind of is that feeling, that I think is written a lot about religious experience, not the formal religious experience per se, but the more mystical, the actual feeling when things all connect, and there is this sense that there's not that division and separation. But it's so available to us, it really is. It's not just, obscure, occult, esoteric stuff. It really is, we do live it if we can train ourselves to see it. And I think there is a certain, I think there's a certain temperament for it, but I do know from just the experience of going through training that you can learn to see that way, once you kind of get in that, kind of go through the portal a little bit.
Yeah. I think that for me, the probably the three ways that I experience it maybe the easiest, or it like comes to you very quickly, is if you really pay attention to your dreams. If you're paying attention to your dreams, the way that I think about it is you wake up in the morning and the dream has left you with some feeling. and you start thinking about the experience, the characters, the setting, whatever it may be, the aspects of the dream, the symbols that come to you. And at some point, when you can finally connect some part of that, what's happening in the dream, to your waking life, you have this feeling that comes over you. And I think that's that numinous feeling that I think that you're talking about. And then the other two places that I feel that is in the creative process. I do writing. And so sometimes I'll write things, I'll write things down, and then they will happen to me in real life. Like I'll write an experience that is critical to the story that I'm engaged in. And it's fiction. It's something that I'm making up. It's never happened to me before. And maybe within the next few months, it'll happen to me. And it's just this overwhelming feeling of what is going on, this like strange connection to the everything. And then the other one is when you notice synchronicities, and part of that is that writing, and then having it happen in real life. But when you're going along and you really notice a strong synchronicity in your life, you can have that same numinous experience. And it's not religious in a sense, but it makes you feel very spiritual. You feel very connected to the universe and all that. I want to circle back to astrology, because, first I'm just curious, how much you know about the origins of astrology or the history of astrology. Is that something that you could speak on?
Well, I'm absolutely a student of the history of astrology, and it's something in the last couple of years, I've been studying at there's a program that Nicholas Campion, who's a well-known, he's an astrologer and is also known as a historian of astrology, and very prolific, and wrote 2 volumes on the history of astrology. So he's quite, really focused on that in his life's work. And so I have been learning a lot in the past couple of years, and a lot of astrologers and astrological writers and thinkers, especially academics who are very specific with their, when did astrology start? They define it in a way. When was the first actual horoscopic astrology? When these kind of historical markers, that are similar, mark kind of the link between now and then, which was probably, I think it was 400 AD when the first individual chart, natal chart was made. But astrology has, in a looser sense, which I'm just as interested in, which, really is about the human ability to symbolize, and to seek patterns, see patterns, and make meaning. That goes back to the beginning of human life. So I think it was 25. I don't know, like to where the point in history. I'm trying to think of the Venus, the very famous Venus that they found. I don't know how many zeros, 25,000. But they would find bones or tusks of animals with notches in them that they, would decipher as the cycles of the moon. Those were probably like the very earliest indicators, kind of like objects, of the sort of calendrical, like watching the cycles of the moon, and forming some kind of correlation. I think with cave drawings, I think there are many more recent kind of discoveries of the animal pictures actually being of the constellations. It's not graphically that clear, but there are probably astrologers, or archaeologists, maybe, kind of working in tandem, but who have have really discovered, been able to see constellations at the points of various animal bodies and configurations of animals, be much more related to the constellations than I think they were, that I don't think for a while had been seen. But it really was the human, that was the map, when you kind of think of our early, and it's certainly the sky was dark, and going back to Sumer and beyond, so they certainly weren't, doing natal astrology. This really was sort of a collective, when, and it was more the omens in Babylonia were more like, when this happens in the sky, this happens on the earth. So it was that kind of correlation or correspondence. And I think that you start to see the gods corresponding. Venus was, besides the sun and the moon, Venus was predominant. And this goes back to the Sumerian god Ishtar and Inanna. So this is very early mythology. But it was not concretized. I don't think the goddess was thought to be the planet per se, but that the planet, again, there was just this correspondence of the qualities that the goddess was in many things of the quality of Venus. So it was that kind of correlation of qualities with the planet, and then with the phenomenology of when Venus was in certain configurations, usually with the sun, because Venus is like Mercury, closer to the sun. So there's a close relationship between those three planets, and there was a sensibility that the planets where there was more movement corresponded to the goddess talking. So the movement and actually corresponding or communicating with humans was correlated. So the planets more distant, like Jupiter and Saturn, which was the last planet that was visible, were thought to be, their movement was much slower. So there was something that was less close to human life and more remote, and therefore more godlike. I mean, even though Venus and Inanna were more living among humans, and I wasn't alive back then, but I really love the notion that it's not, they weren't these separate beings on Mount Olympus, and I'm not sure how the Greeks imagine that, or it sort of there was more of a, when Greek myths really became those kind of stories. I don't know if there was a way where the gods actually seemed to be living their own life somehow on some other level of consciousness. But I do get this feeling just by reading astrological history that there was something, in the more very early kind of pagan thought where, everything was, nature was alive, like there weren't remote, there wasn't an abstraction of these divine beings, so that a lot of the stories of Venus and Inanna, have that feeling, that she's speaking to human beings. So I that to me is astrology. So I think that goes back to the genesis of consciousness of human beings looking at the stars and being able to see movement and paying attention to it. But that's symbolic consciousness to me, is that drawing correspondences. And I think it's what's so exciting about even the fact that astrology has just, I think you were talking a little bit about this. The history of astrology really does trace, how consciousness evolves, what values predominate in certain points in history, and how it waxes and wanes and moves and evolves, and is translated and valued and devalued, and it never goes away. It kind of finds, and so there is something to me about having it be very present, and me finding it useful. And I can talk a little bit about how I use it in my practice too. But the fact that it does go back to the beginning of humankind, and dreams do as well. It really is. Our dreams contain cars now, and cell phones, and my nightmares contain cell phones. But and it used to, like a lot of the dreams Jung writes about, there were horses and carriages, and so, but the archetypal, meaning is the same. So there's that same lineage that I think that connection, again, is really, I don't know, just a wonderful, really important feeling and experience and context to feel, especially now, to just not feel like technology is where everything is, but technology too is in a context of what our brains are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, did you have something else?
Oh, I was just going to add, I don't think technology will, make astrology obsolete.
Yeah, I actually, I appreciate you kind of walking through all of that history. I think one of the phrases that you use that's really interesting to me is the map. That humans need. It's like this. We need something to give us a map of ourselves, or a reflection of ourselves, a mirror, so that we can kind of analyze it in a way. And to think back on those ancient people who could see the stars moving at night, and then they also, you could imagine how integrated their dreams would be with the rest of their lives, with so few distractions, so little distraction compared to what we have today with the advent of technology. I could just imagine that dreams would be the kind of the beginning of all the stories that everybody agreed upon, because even now people have dreams that are very similar. And if you're in a small group of people in the wilderness, and you all go to bed at night, you wake up in the morning, you probably talk about where you've been in your dreams, and you're probably all encountering similar people with similar characteristics. The archetypes, they're all in us. They're like encoded in us. And then to take that next step of viewing the stars, one of the things and using that as a map, and one of the things that Joseph Campbell often talks about is man, the microcosm. And then we have the macrocosm, which is the universe to look at. It's like this, as above, so below. So we're that thing below looking up at what's above, and we're seeing ourselves in it. And I think that's fascinating. And then to go from that place as a species where we are scattered, living in an existence where basically Mother Earth is providing for us. And then with the advent of agriculture, animal husbandry, you start to gather more, you start to become more, you move into that state where you now have cities and city states, and you now have the beginning of empires. And that system of looking to the sky to map yourself just expands, and it becomes, that's when I imagine it would have moved from more of like a spiritual practice, a spiritual understanding, and more into a formalized religion with sets of rules and expectations and pronouncements, and those, and then all of a sudden there's a priestly caste and all of that. But yeah, when I think about where we are today as like a culture, and in the Western world, we have this, we're predominantly monotheistic. We have the Christian world. It's the Judeo-Christian world, or the Abrahamic world, where we have the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims. And as much as the people today want to act as if astrology is just some, at the very beginning of our conversation, you were talking about how people kind of look down on it, or you even were a little bit irritated with it when you started. It's just interesting, because I don't think we could have gotten to where we are without first going through that phase of astrology being the main religion back in, Sumeria, Babylon. And what's really fascinating to me is to connect. I often think about the human psyche as, you can look at it as the microcosm, as each one of us as individuals, but you can also look at it at what Joseph Campbell called the mesocosm, or, just society, the city-state, or the nation. And so psychologically, we kind of operate in the same way, even though it's at different levels. And a lot of people, this is just an interesting thing that I've thought about when it comes to astrology, is that a lot of people, for example, like at the beginning of the year, they'll write down a list of their goals for the year, their New Year's resolutions or things that they want to achieve. Or sometimes people will do like a dream board, or they'll do like a 5-year plan or something. And I think statistically, the chances that you achieve something, or something actually occurs, if you write it down, if you speak it out loud, the chances that it actually occurs go up. It becomes much more likely. And I think it's just because that's kind of the process of how humans interact with the world, is that we put things out into the world with our words. And then because we've already spoken them aloud, we can then go and bring them to fulfillment. To connect that to this mesocosm of like the human species, it seems very interesting to me that there are pronouncements that were made way back when, in the Sumerian times, in the Babylonian times, from these priests of astrology, they seem to be coming to fruition now. And I think it's probably operating in a similar way, where as a species, we wrote it down and we said it out loud. And so there's something about our collective psyche that's going to bring it forward, simply because that's how the human species works. And the one really, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, because these aren't necessarily all my ideas, maybe just some synthesizing of ideas. But Jesus came during the axial age, or the kind of like as a response to the axial age. And in the myth of Jesus, he was the fish, and he gave himself as a sacrifice. And he came in the astrological time period. Help me if I'm getting this wrong, but I want to say it was Pisces.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
yes.
Pisces is the fish. It's like the self-sacrificing thing. And so Jesus came in that period. Psychologically, Jesus was part of this monotheistic tradition, and monotheism is the worship of an individual rather than the worship of a collective. And so those who worship monotheism are like gradually over the centuries becoming more and more individualistic. And then from following the era of Pisces, and then we move into, I want to say it's what is it? You might have it.
Aquarius.
Yes, Aquarius. Okay. I'm not great with all the names. But Aquarius then is supposed to be more geared towards the period of the individual and people standing up for certain things. And so just a really simple example that I find is fascinating, where we we may in our modern day look back on astrology sometimes and shake our head and think, oh, why did people, think that they could map out everything with the stars? But if you look at the bigger picture, it's almost like that period they're just our cultural ancestors, and they mapped it out in a way where we're just going to fulfill it psychologically. I don't know I've been rambling on this for a while, and maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, but I'm curious your thoughts on all of that.
Well, there's a lot there, like the kind of 2,000-year eons which Pisces is one, and moving into the age of Aquarius is the next one. And then we have precursors to that. That's a whole fascinating thing, that we could talk about, which is, these greater collective periods where there was a deep symbolism that permeated many cultures. And you're right about the Piscean age, and each age having kind of a predominant, in the case of Pisces, Jesus being the predominant, embodying the qualities, that just symbolized it, to put it something very complex, simply, but and the sort of interfaces between these huge periods of time, and the astronomy to this is fascinating too. I mean, it has to do with like the Earth wobbling on its axis, and kind of going around in a circle, and sending the vernal equinox counterclockwise. I mean, it's all amazing, kind of the physicality, and then kind of correlating with this larger, kind of human movement. But I wanted to go back to what you were saying, because it relates to this. But when you were saying you wrote, you would write something and then find yourself living it. That is not, as you experience, I mean, this by experiencing, it's not a logical thing that happens. It is a way that I think, especially when one is, in a creative act, things come up from the unconscious. These images appear. And we know from working with the psyche that the unconscious, it's how we experience the unconscious as being prescient. It seems to know the future. It is always dredging up things from the past and what people experience as past lives. So there's this way that the psyche is not sort of fixed in linear time. And so it does, I think there's so many scales there. There's the scale of your life and kind of, writing something and then living it. And so that's actually not a linear thing. It's as if even though it unfolds in a linear way, it has to, because we live in time, we are in time. But it is a way that there's something already in you that is going to unfold. It's not ready to unfold yet, but something comes up from some representation of it, as it will in a dream, come up in a creative process and be the sort of, whatever you want to call it, a kind of harbinger, some way that it, I think this happens too in film. You see, kind of, it's a sort of motif, some strange hint of something, that will then appear at some other time. But there is too a way that on that larger scale of history, things there are sort of precursors. Is a word I'm not kind of thinking of that's better than a precursor. It's kind of like, the rogue wave that, it's not part of the real wave yet, but it's going to happen. So the age of Aquarius, I mean, you're right that it's the age of the individual, but it's the individual and how it fits into society. So it has a very strong societal meaning. But it is the individual within the society, or how that the society is in the individual, and, the connection. But in an individual chart, if someone has a planet in the sign of Aquarius, they usually have a kind of group mentality. I mean, they're kind of, they are in tune with kind of humanity at large. They sort of have that orientation. And then, so that's kind of on a personal level. And then we're just at the beginning in this very kind of long interface as we move into Aquarius. We're experiencing, how this is beginning to unfold, and move from the Piscean age into this new age that we don't know. We do, a lot of astrologers, this is another, fascinating focus, trace these cycles in history. Richard Tarnas is one very well-known person who's written a lot about the historical cycles. And then people who have written about the larger eons or, like Jung actually wrote about, in his book, Ion, he wrote about the Piscean age in a symbolic way. Kind of the mythology of it and the sort of, how the Christ figure really was the symbol of the self. So it did have a lot to do with the individual, the divine in the individual. And it's a whole nother.
Yeah, that makes me think about all of this. This is all very fascinating to me because not only do I look at the past and see things like astrology and other belief systems that existed previously that still linger and still influence what we believe today, but I'm always very curious about where the myth is going, what the next myth is going to be, what the new myth will be, which in a way, have you read Carl Jung's Red Book?
Not cover to cover, no.
Okay, yeah, that's a tough one.
I'm absorbing that like I did astrology. It's going to, I'll make it in there somehow.
Yeah, I just think that he kind of touches on that a little bit, like if, where the way that Jesus is the individual or the self and how that's going to play out through that myth into the next myth. I find it all very interesting.
He was his psyche very much was connecting these and Jung had a lot of Aquarian, whatever you want to say. It's in his chart, it's in his, how he was really anticipating. And yes, I think that's, very much kind of I think at the very beginning of the Red Book, the death of the hero, the heroic individual person. And this, and I think it really inspired Ion because he was very much moving into Aquarius in his kind of psychic anticipation.
Yeah, it seems to me that, somehow we've gotten to where we are as a collective psyche. And it's really easy for us, especially in the day and age we're in with all the technology that we have and the ability to look back on so much and analyze it. It seems sometimes like it can feel that we're at the end of history, but really we're just right in the middle of it and it's going to keep going. And there are going to be people in the future looking back on this age, analyzing us in the same way that we look back. So it's just, I find it very, I wish, sometimes I wish I could be like Moses or Enoch and just get that vision of all things, all eternity. So I just want to know how it all happened and I want to know how it all is going to go. It's fascinating to me. Yeah. And I think as we become more individuals, the Red Book, to me, the reading of the Red Book was like monotheism got us to being individuals, but going forward as individuals, we're going to have to figure out something else. And I have my theories, but there's a part of me that wants to do more research and put it together as like a book or an actual theory before I really put it all out there. But anyways, I do want to circle back around to, you mentioned being able to talk about how you use astrology in your practice. And that is something that's interesting to me because obviously you can see the value in all these images and in the mappings, but how do you help others, use it in their own process, or how do you bring it to them in a way where they can begin to understand it and then employ it in their own healing or growth or individuation, whatever the goal is?
Great question. You don't state your questions in simple ways. It's like that could be a little, another big talk. But so it's a very, it's a very different thing when an astrologer gives an astrological reading. Then so there are some things that do not work at all together between an analytic session being in analysis and astrology. An astrologer's usually, and there are, of course, so many different techniques, and there are some very psychological astrologers who do, but in analysis, you are not bringing new information to a person. You are really listening and bringing out kind of essential things that you're hearing and what they say that link meaningfully, to other things. Hopefully, you're helping them make the links, but it's very much about their material. So and this is something that I moved very slowly into it because I had been working for quite a while as an analyst. And I think I kind of write about this because I was, figuring it out and then tried to articulate it in my website. But I don't use astrology if someone doesn't know astrology. And there are a few cases where someone has found me and liked the idea, like they wanted to start analysis because I liked astrology. It was appealing to them, but they weren't bringing it in themselves. They weren't kind of bringing it up in sessions or talking about it. So, kind of holding the sort of, analytic stance, as we say, I won't be the one to talk about it, that would sort of make me an authority using a language that they don't use. So what's kind of evolved is that I basically work with it on whatever level someone is working on it and using it to give meaning to their life, to what's going on. And so it's really, different with each person. It's kind of evolved to where I probably have the charts of about half the people I work with, maybe a little bit over half. And I very much have the chart present when I'm doing the session. And so I have a way of, if they're kind of conversant in it, it starts to feel very much just like working with any other, sometimes I'll refer to a dream someone had 2 weeks ago if it just suddenly seems really relevant. So it's the same kind of feeling. If someone is talking about something and one part of their chart, is really relevant to it. And if I will bring that, I will say, well, this is, very much about this part of your chart. So it's not giving any kind of overall reading of the chart like an astrologer would, but it's focusing psychologically on, and with some people, just kind of one really central problem, like aspect in their chart that actually does create problems. And there's a way that you're probably familiar with Jung's theory of complexes, which is a very, basic theory of his. We can see how the complexes, we can kind of see them in the chart. And we're not really seeing the complexes, but we're seeing the correspondence between the something that's being lived where someone is, and complexes are, not bad, but if a certain conditioning has just kind of hardened a pattern too much, kind of encapsulated a certain pattern of behavior, so it just doesn't, it is kind of stuck in the personality. It kind of consumes too much energy, or it keeps a sort of integrative thing from happening for the person, because I think complexes really do have this energetic kind of grab, they sort of, in ancient times it was thought of as being possession. They just energetically suck a person into a certain state of being or behavior. And, being able to kind of see that in a chart and give it a kind of symbolic, like have been talking about, a kind of mapping, and if a person does use astrology and is able to kind of really feel the symbolism of, the planets involved and what the aspects mean, because I think, then it can be clarifying. It can be, oh, this is what is uniquely in me, that is, it actually is always going to be there, but it can be lived in a different way. I'm living it in this particular way now, but in understanding the symbolism of these components, I'm just talking about maybe one place in the chart, not the whole chart. It opens up that kind of what Jung talked about, an archetypal spectrum. Like there are more instinctual, compulsive ways that we can act, but by bringing, consciousness to it, which is exactly what we're doing in analysis, we are just kind of bringing it into circulation, like bringing it out of its little kind of isolated, unconscious place. And then it actually opens up, these other options for how it can be used, lived, in a. So it would actually be the very same archetypal configuration, but a very different way of relating to it. And I mean, that might be, a great thing to. I wish I had a great example of that. But so that would be, a kind of focused way that if someone can use astrology. So if they are not using astrology, sometimes I will happen to have their chart anyway, or they'll know their chart, but they just don't really know much about it. So I will certainly be thinking in those terms, but maybe not speaking specifically astrologically. And the reason I don't do that is because, and this getting back to how astrology used to irritate me, it, unless you really do have that kind of deeper symbolic way of, perceiving and feeling into the symbols, astrology can be very concrete. People really do fall, and I think this has something to do with our brain evolution, also temperament, that if something is happening, if there's a concrete representation of something, like a transit, this is kind of a famous place where people will just fall into, if a transit's happening, I'm kind of a subject of the transit, a helpless, it's just going to happen to me. And then, or their chart, like, okay, that's a bad configuration. That's just, I'm kind of doomed to have that. It's kind of this stamp of, something that astrological books say is a negative thing and a malefic planet. And so it kind of does the opposite, if someone is just, gets stuck on the surface level. And I think because astrology it does have that physically real component, both like the drawing of the chart, but also these planets are moving up there, and that it can get people, it could hold them away from that symbolic connection. At the same time, if they can get the symbolic connection, then I do think it's one of the most interesting psychological places to work, and to kind of feel connected, feel like, okay, me as this little human being, I'm actually having this experience that is part of the universe. I'm having it on my level, but I'm connected in this way. And yes, the timing, I'm kind of part of this bigger timing, and it's hard for me to feel like that's my timing. I didn't consciously, design that, or, that wasn't in my plan for the year that I wrote out January 1st. But to feel that kind of participation with it without, kind of giving up control of it. It can be a really, I don't know, and that's why I love astrology. I don't know anything quite like it that can sort of give us this concrete correlation that is saying, yes, you're part of the universe. This is happening, and you can really have, and this is where, free will and determinism, which is just, again, an age-old, human conversation, but astrologers really talk about this a lot. And it's this complex balance, it's just like, yes, we do have some free will, but, we're also just, there's something much bigger than us that we have to also kind of be subject to, but many different ways to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's the universe or the unconscious or...
Right.
Yeah. I think everybody in every age probably has a tendency to literalize or, make more concrete their belief system. Astrology is a really great example of this, but I think that all of the myths and all of the systems, they're all just maps. And the map, one of my favorite expressions is the map is never the terrain. So it's really, really helpful for you to help you understand the terrain. But if you literalize it too much, you start accepting the labels too intensely, then you become subject to them. You can't grow beyond them. And astrology, I imagine, is very similar to that.
No, very well put, and yes, very much.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for over an hour. I know it goes really quick. It's just, you jump into it and it's all just so interesting. I could have this conversation for another couple hours, to be honest, but I will
there's so many rabbit holes to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't really get into alchemy, and that's another one that I find fascinating, and is especially as like another map, another way to see the reflection of ourselves in this system. But if somebody was interested in working with you, if they want to reach you, contact you, where could they find you online?
Not many places, but I do have a website that has the essential information. It's hugely in need of being updated, but they can find me there. But it's just CynthiaPoorbaugh.com. That's my website, and I'm listed with the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association. If anyone's just kind of interested in that context. And yeah, I think the public program at the C.G. Jung Foundation is a place where, people want to enter in. I've taught some astrologically related courses, over the years, not in the last year or two, but that's also a good resource if someone isn't really, ready to dive into analysis, but just wants to take some interesting classes and be related to that.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. I really appreciate you taking your time. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you for contacting me. This was, I could talk about this too all day.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.